On the morning of the wedding, she cornered me in the dressing room. When he sees you in that dress, he'll regret proposing, she whispered. I didn't argue. I simply texted the one woman who could end her pride in a single step.
My name is Lauren Hayes, and this is the story of how I found out who I was really marrying and chose to walk into my own wedding with the one woman his family never expected to see by my side. I spent most of my life believing that stability was something you earned, not something you were born into. My parents split when I was young, and the fallout turned our home into a quiet battlefield where the debris was measured in small sacrifices: missed birthdays, strained phone calls, promises made too late. I grew up determined not to repeat their mistakes. I built a career in corporate communications, sharpened my instincts, learned to choose my words carefully, and taught myself that respect was something you could secure if you showed enough grace. But grace becomes a weakness when people decide you don't deserve it. I didn't know that yet when I met Ethan. He appeared steady, self-assured, the kind of man who didn't seem shaken by life's unpredictability. We were both in our mid-30s, both tired in the same wear-worn, by half-lived relationships and the emotional negotiations that never led anywhere meaningful. I liked that he listened when I talked about my job, that he didn't flinch when I mentioned my parents' divorce, that he called me the most grounded woman he'd ever met. Somewhere inside, a part of me softened. I wanted to believe that steadiness could finally be mine. The first time he introduced me to his mother, Margaret, I remember thinking she looked like someone carved from cold marble: impeccable posture, restrained expression, eyes that absorbed everything in the room except the person she didn't approve of. She shook my hand lightly, as if she didn't want to risk touching something that might leave a stain. At the time, I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself she was protective, cautious, maybe even shy. But the truth is, some people don't need to raise their voice to tell you you're not welcome. Margaret spoke in coded messages disguised as politeness. At dinner that night, she complimented Ethan's ex-girlfriend, Claire, with such nostalgic fondness it felt rehearsed. "She always knew how to dress appropriately for formal events," she said, glancing deliberately at my simple blouse. Elegant, understated, a natural fit in our circles. Ethan didn't notice the barb. Or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. When I shifted uncomfortably, he squeezed my knee under the table as if to say, "Don't make this a thing." I swallowed my pride and smiled, pretending not to feel the bruise forming where her words had landed. Over the months, the comments grew sharper, but never loud enough to be called insults. "Some women come from families that don't understand tradition," she'd say with a sympathetic tilt of her head. Or, "I suppose your parents did what they could." She scrutinized the way I held my glass, the way I phrased my opinions, even the way I once laughed at a joke that she apparently didn't think matched the moment's decorum. It wasn't the content of her remarks that hurt. It was the careful precision behind them, the surgical intent to make me shrink without giving me anything concrete to confront. The first major warning sign with Ethan came when he asked me to be patient with her after she dismissed one of my wedding ideas in front of his relatives. I had suggested incorporating a reading my late grandmother used to love, a small personal touch, nothing extravagant. Margaret scoffed softly and said, "That doesn't fit the tone of our family ceremonies, dear. We'll keep things traditional." Ethan sat beside me, silent, giving me the same placating smile he used in restaurants when the waiter got his order wrong, but he didn't want to cause a scene. I should have noticed that his fear of conflict outweighed his loyalty. There were other signs, too, small ones that I ignored. When Margaret criticized my career as stressful and unfeminine, Ethan laughed awkwardly instead of defending me. When she insisted on choosing the florist because your taste leans casual, he agreed without checking how I felt. When she suggested that my father might feel uncomfortable attending certain pre-wedding events, Ethan assured her she could handle the schedule. Each time, I told myself I was being dramatic. Each time, I told myself that marriage was about compromise. But compromise isn't supposed to feel like erasure. The worst moment came during a large family gathering 2 months before the wedding. I stood beside Ethan in a room full of his relatives, smiling through conversations that felt more like interrogations. Margaret took center stage, recounting the milestones of Ethan's life, his scholarships, his achievements, his impeccable taste. When someone asked how we met, she interrupted me before I could answer. She was very persistent, she said lightly, as if she were describing a stray dog that had followed him home. The guests laughed politely. I felt my face flush, but I forced the same tight smile everyone else wore. Later that night, as Ethan and I walked to the car, he brushed off the incident. "You know how my family jokes," he said. "They're harmless." I didn't respond, because any response would have exposed how much it stung, how small it made me feel, and how desperately I wanted him to simply acknowledge it. But Ethan had learned long ago that the easiest way to coexist with his mother was to keep the peace at all costs. I didn't yet realize that he expected me to adopt the same strategy. The more Margaret pushed, the more I tried to prove myself worthy. It was a trap I didn't see forming until it was too late. I volunteered for tasks she assigned me last minute. I apologized when she implied I had misunderstood her instructions. I held back when she belittled my choices. I toned down myself to fit her idea of appropriate. And each time I shrank, Margaret's confidence grew. She believed she had me neatly placed in the hierarchy she had curated for years. Ethan at the top, his family next, and me somewhere below, grateful for crumbs of approval. By the week of the wedding, my chest carried a constant tightness, a small knot that pulsed with every new insult I swallowed. I kept telling myself that once Ethan and I were married, things would change. His mother wouldn't matter as much. We would build our own life. I would have a place where I wasn't constantly evaluated. I couldn't have predicted that the very person I was trying to impress, the woman whose approval I thought would secure the peace I craved, would be the one to push me into uncovering a truth Ethan had worked hard to hide. And I certainly didn't expect that the one woman who would help me destroy Margaret's illusions wasn't a friend, or a relative, or even someone from my past. She was the woman my fiancé had been living with during our engagement. And the moment Margaret cornered me in the dressing room on the morning of the wedding, I realized that some battles aren't meant to be avoided, they're meant to be won. The silence after the door shut was so sharp it felt like a blade pressed against my skin. I stood there, frozen, staring at the place where Margaret's reflection had vanished from the mirror. My breath came in tight, uneven pulls, the kind that scrape the inside of your chest. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. It was as if she had reached inside me, found the smallest, most insecure part of who I once was, and yanked it violently to the surface. And the worst part was that she knew exactly what she was doing. She always knew. I sank onto the edge of the small velvet chair, the stiff tulle of my dress folding around me like an accusation. The weight of her words pressed against my ribs. When he sees you in that dress, he'll regret proposing. I replayed it in my mind, each time feeling it twist deeper. A part of me whispered that maybe she was right. Maybe Ethan did deserve someone more polished, someone bred for the kind of world Margaret thought she ruled. But the larger part, the part that had clawed her way through life without anyone smoothing the path for her, refused to let that thought settle. I lifted my hands and looked at the faint tremble in my fingers. That tremble wasn't just anger. It was fear, the fear that I had ignored too many signs, forgiven too many small betrayals, and allowed too many people to decide who I was for me. And the truth I didn't want to acknowledge was that Margaret wasn't the real threat to this wedding. She was simply the one bold enough to say out loud what Ethan had been acting out in silence. I stood up again, forcing myself to move, pacing the narrow length of the room. The dress rustled with each step, like a reminder that this day was supposed to be the beginning of something beautiful. Instead, it felt like the moment before impact. The bouquet, the one I hadn't even chosen, lay on the table, perfect and sterile, like the rest of this wedding. Margaret had selected it, of course. "White roses are timeless, dear," she'd said. "They photograph well." Every decision had been about presentation, not meaning. And I'd let her. That was the part that stung the most. I could hear muffled voices in the hallway, bridesmaids laughing, coordinators giving instructions, distant music from the ceremony area being tested. The world outside was moving forward, assuming I was ready to step into a life that was becoming less mine by the minute. I pressed my palm against my chest, trying to calm the thundering rhythm of my heartbeat. I felt tears pushing up, but I swallowed them down. Crying now would make Margaret right. Crying would make her victorious. I whispered to myself, "You can get through this." But even as I said it, the lie tasted bitter. Why was I still trying to get through something that was clearly breaking me? Why was I still convincing myself that peace could be carved out of a family built on judgment and pretense? Why was I still hoping that Ethan, the man I thought I knew, would stand up for me when he hadn't done it once? I walked back to the mirror, searching my reflection for something familiar, something strong. But all I saw was a woman dressed in a role someone else had scripted for her. My voice sounded small when I said quietly, "This is not the life you wanted." The woman in the mirror didn't argue. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had spent too long making herself small so others could feel tall. I remembered the first time Margaret had said something that shook me. It was during our engagement dinner. She'd complimented the ring Ethan gave me, not for its beauty, but for being respectable enough to avoid embarrassment. At the time, I laughed it off. Now, I understood it was the first brick in the wall she had built around me, one judgment at a time. A knock at the door startled me. My heart jolted, thinking Margaret had come back for a second attack, but it wasn't her. It was Lily, Ethan's cousin, the only person in that family who had ever looked at me with something like empathy. "Lauren," she called softly, "are you okay?" "They're asking if you need more time." I stared at the door, torn between answering and pretending I didn't hear her. If I opened that door, I'd be agreeing to step back into the narrative Margaret had written. If I stayed silent, maybe the moment would stretch long enough for me to breathe, to think. But Lily didn't go away. She opened the door just a crack and peeked in. When she saw my face, she stepped inside and closed it behind her. She looked at me like she already knew something had gone wrong. "You look pale," she whispered. For the first time that morning, I felt my throat loosen. "Your aunt was here," I said. Lily's jaw tightened. What did she say? I hesitated, then repeated it. Every word. Lily's expression shifted from disbelief to disgust. She let out a breath. She had no right. None. I wanted to believe that. But the truth was, Margaret acted that way because she knew Ethan wouldn't stop her. I sank back onto the chair, and Lily crouched down in front of me, taking my hands. "You don't deserve this," she said quietly. Something inside me cracked at those words. I had been starving for validation, for someone to acknowledge that I wasn't imagining the cruelty. I squeezed her hands back, grateful, but the ache didn't disappear. "What am I supposed to do?" I whispered. Walk out there and pretend everything is fine? Lily hesitated for a moment, then said something that surprised me. You do whatever makes you feel whole, whatever lets you walk away from this room without feeling like you've surrendered. She didn't say get married. She didn't say go through with it. She offered me permission to choose myself, something Ethan and his mother had never done. But even in that moment of clarity, even as my lungs finally filled with something other than panic, I realized there was still one truth lingering under all of it, the truth about Ethan. The truth I hadn't confronted. The truth that made Margaret's words feel like the final blow, not the first. Because deep down, I already knew that he wasn't the man I thought he was. And that knowledge, the knowledge of who he had really been with during our engagement, pulsed beneath the surface, like a bruise waiting to be touched. I wasn't ready to admit it to Lily. I wasn't ready to say it out loud. But the moment Margaret left that room, my rage sharpened into a single, irreversible decision. If they wanted a performance, I would give them one. Just not the one they expected. When the door clicked shut, something inside me shifted. The humiliation was still hot, still raw, still scraping at my nerves like sandpaper, but beneath it, something else settled in, a colder, sharper feeling that had been waiting for this exact moment. Clarity. Margaret thought she had just delivered the final blow, that I would crumble, wipe my eyes, and still walk out there grateful to marry her son. She saw every silence of mine as proof that I could be controlled. She mistook my patience for submission. And she had no idea what I already knew about her perfect golden boy. 2 months before the wedding, the first cracks started forming, though I didn't want to admit it then. Ethan began working late, the phrase slipping out so casually that I almost didn't catch the echo of every story I'd heard from women who ignored their instincts. At first, I told myself he was stressed. Promotions, projects, deadlines, that was the narrative he fed me, and I swallowed it because it was easier than tasting the bitterness of suspicion. The late-night calls he took in the hallway, the weekends he spent at team retreats, the way his phone never left his pocket or the table face down, I stacked those moments in a quiet corner of my mind and labeled them paranoia. I've always been hyper-aware of conflict. Growing up between two parents who barely tolerated each other after the divorce, I learned that sometimes peace is just an agreement to ignore the obvious. So when my stomach twisted at the way Ethan flinched when his phone buzzed, I reminded myself, you're projecting. When he brushed off my questions with a laugh and a kiss, saying, you know how crazy things get before a big launch, I forced a smile and pretended it was enough. I wanted to believe him more than I wanted to trust myself. Then, one night, the illusion cracked. We were on his couch, exhausted from yet another weekend of wedding errands that Margaret had orchestrated like a general planning a campaign. Ethan fell asleep halfway through a movie, his head tipped back, his breathing deep and even. I sat beside him, absently scrolling through my own phone, trying not to think about the way his mother had corrected me at lunch in front of the florist. Again. I remember the way my chest felt tight, like something was pressing down on my ribs from the inside. His phone buzzed in his hand, the screen lighting up just enough for me to see the notification. I told myself to look away. I really did. But my eyes caught the preview before I could stop them. A name I didn't recognize, Renee. And beneath it, a line that cut straight through my denial. I hate waking up without you. My whole body went cold, then hot, then numb. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't scroll. I didn't need to. Those 6 words held more truth than anything Ethan had told me in weeks. My mind scrambled for explanations, Maybe it was an old message, maybe it was a joke, maybe I was misunderstanding. But deep down, the part of me that had spent years reading tone and subtext for a living knew exactly what this was. I sat there in the dark, listening to him breathe, feeling like I was sharing a couch with a stranger. A sour taste filled my mouth. I thought of Margaret praising his integrity, insisting she had raised him with values. I thought of the smug confidence in her eyes every time she implied I was the one who didn't measure up. Rage flared up, but I pushed it down. Confronting him in that moment would have given him the advantage. He'd have time to spin, to twist, to paint me as insecure. So instead of waking him, I watched the light fade from his screen and quietly filed that moment away as a turning point. Something had shifted. Not in him. He'd clearly made his choices long before that night. But in me. I stopped telling myself comforting lies. Over the next weeks, I stopped trying to prove I trusted him and started paying attention. I noticed how he always turned his phone face down when we were together. How certain calls were answered only if he could step outside the room. How he was more attentive, more affectionate on the days after he claimed to be buried in meetings. I began to map his behavior in my head, tracing patterns the way I would track inconsistencies in a client's story at work. It felt clinical at first, but underneath it throbbed a deep, quiet hurt. Part of me kept whispering, maybe this can still be fixed. Another part hissed back, and what if it shouldn't be? I didn't go through his phone. That's something I still cling to, my refusal to dig like a thief in my own relationship. Instead, I went outside of it. I reached out to a mutual acquaintance, Jenna, who worked in the same general field as Ethan. I kept my voice light, casual. Hey, do you know anyone named Renee who works with Ethan? Someone texted him during a late meeting, and I just realized I've never heard of her. There was a pause on the other end of the call, the kind that isn't about bad reception. Oh, Jenna said slowly. Yeah, I think he mentioned helping out a friend named Renee a while back. Something about her needing a place to stay for a bit while she sorted her situation. Her tone told me more than her words. People always give away more than they intend when they're trying not to get involved. During our engagement, I asked carefully. Another pause. I'm not sure about the exact dates, she replied. I just remember him saying it was a little complicated, but he was doing the right thing. Doing the right thing. I almost laughed. After that, I went looking. It didn't take long to find her online. Renee Parker. Her profile was public enough for me to see pieces of a life she clearly thought she'd built with someone she trusted. There were photos of her in a living room I recognized, the same couch, the same lamp, the same framed print Ethan had once told me he'd picked out to make the place feel more like home. Only in her photos, there were extra details. A mug I'd never seen. A throw blanket that wasn't mine. A set of keys on the table next to a stack of mail with both of their names. I scrolled slowly, my heart hammering. There were captions that made my skin prickle. Our place never feels right when you're gone. Counting down the days until you're home for good. And always the same undercurrent of intimacy, of belonging. I took screenshots of everything. That was the moment the pain started turning into something else, into a record, into evidence, into a story I would one day decide how to tell. I went back through his calendar in my head. The team retreat weekends that overlapped with her posts from cozy movie nights. The late client dinners that matched her photos of takeout spread across that too familiar coffee table. The small inconsistencies I had brushed aside now aligned like coordinates on a map. Each new detail stung, but together they formed a weapon Margaret couldn't even imagine existed. Her perfect son, the one she insisted was too good for me, had been living a double life while she lectured me on dignity. I didn't confront him. Every instinct I had screamed at me to demand answers, to throw my findings in his face, to force him to look at what he'd done. But another instinct, the one that had watched Margaret carefully all these months, told me to wait. People like her didn't respond to tears or accusations. They responded to power, to public perception, to control. So I smiled through cake tastings and venue walkthroughs. I nodded politely at Margaret's monologues about our image and the importance of maintaining standards. I listened to Ethan describe honeymoon plans, his voice smooth and practiced, and I stored every word away as just another line in a script he'd been reciting for years. He thought I was clinging to the dream. He had no idea I was plotting my exit. The turning point came when I decided to contact Renee. I stared at her profile picture for a long time before sending the message. She looked like me in certain ways. Our ages were close. Our expressions carried the same kind of cautious hope. I wondered how many explanations he had given her, how many half-truths she had accepted, how many times she'd been told to be patient or trust him. I wondered if she also had a Margaret in her life, or if she thought she was the only one fighting to hold on to him. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I finally typed, "Hi, Renee. I think we should talk about Ethan." I expected hesitation, or silence, or defensiveness. What I got instead was immediate. "Who is this?" she replied within minutes. "Lauren," I wrote, "his fiancé." There was no response for a full 10 minutes. I watched the typing indicator appear, disappear, then appear again. Finally, the message came through. "I thought you were his ex." The floor inside me gave way. I sank into a chair, phone clutched in my hand, realizing in that moment that Ethan had lied to her about me as thoroughly as he had lied to me about her. Whatever story he'd spun, we were both standing in the ruins of it without knowing the other existed. We arranged to meet in a place where no one would recognize us. When I saw her walk in, I felt a strange urge to apologize to her, even though I was the one betrayed too. She sat across from me, eyes tight, jaw clenched, every muscle in her face carrying the weight of disappointment. "I thought you were out of the picture," she said quietly. "He told me the engagement ended months ago." "He told me you were just a friend who needed a place to crash for a week," I answered. We stared at each other, and for a brief moment, the absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Two women, both believing they had chosen a man who was honest and reliable, now sitting together in the aftermath of his stories. She showed me her phone. Texts, photos, dates that overlapped perfectly with our venue visits, our planning sessions, our dress fittings. "This was the weekend he said he was at a work conference," I murmured, staring at a picture of them on his couch, her feet tucked under his leg, their hands intertwined. Every new piece hardened my heart further. By the time she reached the messages from just a few weeks earlier, "Can't wait until it's just us, no drama," I felt something in me click into place. It wasn't just rage anymore. It was resolution. "I'm so sorry," Renee said, wiping at her eyes. "I didn't know. I never would have." "I know," I replied. And I did. I could see it in her. She hadn't been the villain I had once imagined in my late-night spirals. She was just another woman fed a script and asked to improvise her life around a man's lies. We talked for a long time. We compared notes, timelines, the exact phrasing of his promises. The patterns were unmistakable. He had told us both versions of the same things. I've never felt this understood. You're the one person I can be myself with. Just give me time and everything will make sense. The only thing that made sense now was how carefully he had woven our lives together without expecting them to ever collide. When we parted ways that day, we didn't make a dramatic pact. There were no vows of joint revenge, no late-night plotting. There was just a shared understanding that the truth existed, documented in pixels and timestamps, whether he acknowledged it or not. I left with a folder of screenshots she'd sent me, concrete proof of everything I already knew in my gut. She left with mine. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, my life split into 2 layers. On the surface, everything marched forward. Rehearsals, final fittings, seating charts. Margaret hovering over every detail, correcting place cards, insisting on specific music choices, reminding everyone that appearances matter. Ethan flitted between roles, dutiful son, charming fiancé, stressed professional, never once suspecting that the ground beneath him had been quietly rearranged. Underneath that surface, I was working. I backed up everything: messages, photos, notes from my conversation with Renee. I forwarded the evidence to an email account separate from my own, just in case someone accidentally got access to my phone. I confided in one person outside the situation, my closest friend, Emily, who listened in stunned silence as I laid it all out. "Are you going to call off the wedding?" she asked gently. I stared at her for a long moment. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I know I'm not going to let them walk me down that aisle as if nothing is wrong. I'm done playing along with their script." As the wedding day approached, the tension inside me grew, but it wasn't the same fear I'd felt before. It was something sharper, cleaner. A sense that I was standing at the edge of a decision no one could make for me. Not my parents, not Ethan, not Margaret, with her standards and her rules. By the time I sat in that dressing room on my wedding morning, I wasn't just a humiliated bride in a dress someone else had chosen. I was a woman holding a loaded file of truth. Margaret thought her words would break me, that she was delivering the final push to make me obedient for life. Instead, she unknowingly handed me the last missing piece of resolve I needed. As soon as she walked out, I picked up my phone, my fingers steady for the first time that morning. I opened my messages, scrolled to Renee's name, and typed one simple line: "If you still want the truth to come out, be at the ceremony today. I'll be waiting for you at the entrance." I hit send. Then I set the phone down, looked at myself in the mirror, and realized that for the first time in this entire process, I wasn't the one waiting to see what they would do. They would be the ones watching what I did next. The ceremony was supposed to begin at noon sharp, but the minutes stretched far beyond that, thick and tense, like the air before a thunderstorm. I knew, without stepping inside, that Margaret was pacing near the entrance with that tight, performative smile she used whenever things slipped out of her control. She would be whispering sharp comments to anyone who passed. Some brides don't understand punctuality. If she can't handle a schedule, how will she handle a household? Fully convinced that she still owned the room. What she didn't know was that I was standing just outside the doors, veil lifted, bouquet steady in my hand, waiting not for permission, but for impact. The car pulled up beside me, tires crunching softly against the gravel. My pulse jumped, even though I had expected it, even though I had been the one to orchestrate every second of this moment. Renee stepped out slowly, her eyes scanning the venue with a quiet dread. She wasn't dressed to outshine anyone, no dramatic entrance, no attempt at spectacle. She wore a simple dress, hair pulled back, hands clutching the small black folder to her chest like it contained the last proof of who she had been before Ethan rewrote her life. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. In daylight, she didn't look like a rival. She looked like someone who had been carrying her heartbreak alone, someone who had asked herself 100 times if she misread everything. The same questions I had asked myself. The wind tugged lightly at her hair, and when her eyes met mine, I saw the mixture of fear and resolve there. We weren't enemies. We were the two halves of a truth that Ethan hoped would never meet. I nodded toward the entrance. "Ready?" I asked quietly. She swallowed, her throat moving with the effort to steady herself, and nodded. "Ready?" The coordinator saw us approaching and blinked, clearly thrown. I didn't explain. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. When we reached the main doors, I touched the handle, and with a push, the ceremony room unfolded before us in a wave of warm lights, soft decorations, and expectant faces. Conversations stilled. The music faltered for a beat, then stopped entirely when Renee stepped into view beside me. The room froze. I felt dozens of eyes sharpen with confusion, curiosity, discomfort. I could almost hear the collective inhale as we stepped forward, walking in perfect sync, our steps echoing louder than any wedding march ever could. Renee kept her gaze forward, clutching the folder so tightly her knuckles were white. I kept mine on the aisle, straight, steady, unhurried. Every footstep felt like reclamation. Halfway down, I saw Ethan's face for the first time. The color drained from it so quickly, it looked like someone had pulled the life straight out of him. His eyes widened, first in shock, then in recognition, then in panic. He took a step forward, then froze, as if his legs refused to follow the commands firing inside his head. Behind him, Margaret's expression went through its own transformation. Outrage, disbelief, denial, and finally something she wasn't used to feeling at all. Fear. The officiant cleared his throat nervously, glancing between us as though waiting for someone to tell him what to do. The guests shifted in their seats, the air thick with anticipation. The tension was palpable. An invisible wire stretched from one end of the room to the other, ready to snap. I stopped halfway down the aisle, the spot where brides usually pause to adjust their dress, to smile dreams into the crowd. Instead, I turned toward them, reached for the microphone on the small stand, and felt an unexpected calm settle over me. When I spoke, my voice didn't shake. I was told this morning that I'm not worthy of wearing white. A ripple ran through the audience, a soft gasp from someone in the middle row. I looked directly at Margaret. She held herself completely still, chin lifted, complexion splotching beneath her careful makeup. Apparently, I continued, some of us forgot what dignity really looks like. I stepped aside just enough for the crowd to see Renee clearly, and for the first time, the murmurs began. It didn't take them long to guess who she was, not because they recognized her, but because Ethan's reaction said everything. He was already shaking his head, already lifting his hands in protest, already sweating through his shirt collar. I nodded at Renee. Her fingers trembled as she opened the folder, but when she spoke, her voice was steady, quieter than mine, but anchored in truth. She read dates first, then messages, then showed printed screenshots, bold black and white proof of Ethan telling her he loved waking up with her mornings before things got complicated. She listed the weekends he had spent with her while telling me he was on work trips. She read the text where he told her my name, not as his fiancé, but as someone he used to see. Every sentence was a blow. Every photo was a revelation. The shift in the room was immediate. Curiosity turned to shock. Shock turned to disgust. Guests exchanged glances, whispered harshly, muttered things they didn't bother to hide. Ethan tried to interrupt, stepping forward with his hands raised. "You're twisting everything," he said loudly, desperate. "This isn't what it looks like. It's complicated." But no one moved to help him, not even his father. Margaret reached for her husband's arm, but he pulled it away, staring at Ethan like he'd never seen him before. Her lips parted as if she wanted to demand silence, to regain control, but her voice didn't come. For the first time since I met her, she had nothing to weaponize. Her power evaporated in real time, the room refusing to fall back into her orbit. Only one person looked at me with anything but judgment: Lily. She stood near the back, hands clasped by her mouth, tears shining in her eyes. When our gazes met, she gave me the smallest, proudest nod, as if to say, "You deserve better." And I felt that nod, like a hand at the center of my back, steadying me. When Renee finished, she stepped back, her chest rising and falling with the weight of what she'd just done. Silence washed over the room. Heavy. Unavoidable. I lifted the bouquet from my hand, not because I needed it, but because holding it suddenly felt absurd. I placed it on the nearest chair and turned fully to Ethan. "I won't marry a man who needs 2 lives to feel like a whole person." A soft gasp rippled across the rows. Then I turned and walked back up the aisle, the same path I had walked down just minutes earlier, but with a different spine, a different breath, a different understanding of my own worth. I didn't rush, I didn't bow my head, I didn't apologize. Guests parted automatically, creating a clear path, as though even the air recognized that this was not a retreat. This was a reclamation. And for the first time all day, I wasn't the one being judged. The hours after the ruined ceremony passed in a strange, suspended quiet, the kind that makes every breath feel louder than footsteps echoing through an empty hall. I sat alone in a small side room that had been prepared as a bridal retreat, though now it felt more like a holding cell between the life I almost entered and the life I was about to reclaim. The walls were still decorated with soft florals, remnants of a celebration that had died before it ever began. I expected tears, trembling, the kind of collapse people imagine when a bride walks away from the altar. But none of it came. Instead, there was a calmness that spread slowly through my chest, as if my heart finally understood it no longer had to brace for the next blow. Every sound outside the door came to me muted, as though the world was wrapped in thick fabric. The rise and fall of voices, sharp arguments, hurried explanations, attempts to reorganize the story, were distant waves breaking against a shore I no longer belonged to. I knew Margaret would be trying to salvage what she could of the family's dignity, talking fast, gesturing sharply, insisting on her version of the truth. I imagined Ethan pacing somewhere nearby, tugging at his collar, running his hands through his hair, stammering excuses he believed would sound reasonable to the right audience. None of it mattered anymore. For the first time since I met the Coles, their opinions no longer held the power to shape my decisions. As I sat there, I allowed myself to look back, really look back, at the months that led to this moment. I replayed every time I had swallowed my truth to keep the peace. The dinners where Margaret slipped in insults disguised as observations. The way Ethan never stepped in, never corrected her, never acknowledged the sting behind her polished words. The moments when he dismissed my concerns with a gentle touch or a half smile, softening me just enough so I would let the issue slide. Each silence had felt small at the time, like choosing calm over conflict. But small sacrifices pile up, and eventually you look at yourself and realize you've been giving away pieces of your dignity without even noticing. I thought about the night I first sensed Ethan drifting away. He'd come home later and later, smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine. I asked him once, casually, if everything was okay. He kissed my forehead and said, "You worry too much." I wanted to believe him so badly that I forced myself to ignore the truth hiding behind his gentle tone. I'd been conditioned by my own past to avoid shaking the foundation of relationships, even when the cracks were obvious. My parents' divorce taught me that conflict could swallow entire families whole. My instinct had always been to bend instead of break. That instinct nearly cost me my future. The knock on the door came softly, almost hesitant. For a split second, I tensed, bracing myself from Margaret's cold silhouette. But when the door opened just enough for Lily to slip through, I exhaled. She looked exhausted, eyes red, shoulders tense, her formal dress slightly crooked, as if she'd rushed away from something unpleasant. She closed the door behind her and crossed the room in 2 quick steps before sinking into the seat beside me. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just sat there, letting the quiet settle between us. When she finally spoke, her voice was rough. "I'm proud of you, Lauren." The sincerity in her tone pierced through the last remaining layer of numbness around my heart. She wasn't saying it to soften the blow or to mend the chaos outside. She meant it. And that meant more to me than any apology or sympathetic glance I'd received in months. She told me how some guests had walked out without saying goodbye, refusing to be part of the Coles' desperate attempt to maintain dignity. Others whispered angrily about Ethan's deception, shaking their heads as if they'd never expected anything less. A few had even confronted him directly, their voices carrying enough disappointment to make him shrink. And Margaret, she had been the storm at the center of it all, demanding explanations, insisting that I had orchestrated a malicious scene, accusing Renee and me of conspiring to destroy the family. But her control over the room had evaporated. People no longer looked at her with admiration. They looked at her with discomfort. Lily rested her hand briefly on mine. "You did what a lot of women never get the courage to do. You didn't let them define you." Her words lingered, even after she slipped back out of the room. I stayed seated for a few minutes more, letting the quiet settle like dust over everything that had crumbled. Then I stood, smoothing my dress, not because I wanted to preserve its beauty, but because I wanted to stand tall as I stepped out of that room. The hallway was nearly empty. The flowers still lined the walls, the remnants of music still vibrated faintly in the air, but the illusion of celebration had died. I walked past the venue staff, who looked at me with a kind mixture of respect and bewildered admiration. Not one person tried to stop me. Not one person asked if I was sure. Outside, the sky had shifted into a muted gray, the kind that comes before evening fully settles. I took a deep breath, and the air tasted different, cleaner, lighter, free of expectations. I walked to my car without looking back, the sound of my steps steady and unbroken. No dress train dragging, no trembling hands, just a woman reclaiming her direction. In the weeks that followed, life moved differently. People reached out. Old friends, acquaintances from work, distant relatives who had heard fragments of what happened. Some apologized for not noticing sooner how I had been treated. Others admired how I had chosen truth over appearance. A few, always careful with their words, said they hoped I was healing, as if my heart had cracked open on that aisle. But the truth was, the real wound hadn't been inflicted that day. It had been healing since the moment I finally chose to speak. Ethan wrote long messages, some defensive, some pleading, some strangely poetic, as if he believed vulnerability would absolve him. He blamed stress, confusion, family pressure, fear of failure. He wrote that he had loved both of us in different ways, as though that made his choices less devastating. I read the first few lines of each message, then archived them. I didn't block him because blocking felt too much like emotional reaction. Choosing silence felt like control. Even Margaret wrote once. A cold, clipped email blaming me for humiliating her family, for orchestrating a scene unbecoming of a woman seeking respect, for destroying Ethan's prospects. I reread it once, marveling at how a woman could twist her son's betrayal into an act of victimhood for herself. Then I deleted it. No anger. No reply. My silence toward her was not fear. It was dismissal. As the days passed, I found myself feeling lighter, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. Like shedding a weight I had carried so long, I forgot life without it. I realized how many compromises I had made, softening my opinions, adjusting my tone, making myself smaller to avoid confrontation. I realized how often women are praised for endurance instead of boundaries, for tolerance instead of truth. I realized I had been living in a quiet war between who I was and who I'd been asked to become. Breaking my silence wasn't just an act of rebellion, it was an act of self-return. The consequences rippled outward. Margaret's social circle grew quieter. Some of her friends distanced themselves, not wanting to associate with scandal. Ethan's colleagues whispered behind closed doors, questioning his integrity. Even within the Cole family, the fractures deepened. Lily later told me that several relatives finally addressed years of Margaret's controlling behavior, things they had only dared to discuss in private glances before. And me? I found peace in the kind of quiet that no longer demanded anything from me. I spent mornings walking without checking my phone. I spent evenings reconnecting with parts of myself I had muted. I learned to enjoy silence not as a shield, but as space. Space to choose, space to breathe, space to rebuild a life that was truly mine. For the first time in years, I understood that silence can be two very different things. The silence I carried before the wedding was fear of losing what I thought I needed. The silence I carried afterward was strength, a boundary drawn with the kind of clarity I had earned through fire. I didn't leave the wedding with a partner or a future planned, but I left with something incomparable, the certainty that I would no longer negotiate my worth, that no one would ever again speak for me, belittle me, diminish me without facing the truth I was now unafraid to wield. That I would never shrink myself to fit someone else's image of what a woman should be. I walked out alone. And for the first time, I felt whole.